February 26th, 2022. Mark this date in your memory. It wasn't just a geopolitical escalation in Eastern Europe. It was the exact moment the Western world committed financial suicide. 2 days after Russian tanks crossed the border, Washington and Brussels made a decision that would irrevocably fracture the global economic order. They announced the ultimate punishment. Russia would be severed from SWIFT. For decades, this was the nuclear option of financial warfare. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT, is not just a messaging service. It is the central nervous system of global capitalism, connecting over 11,000 banking institutions across 200 nations. It processes $5 trillion in transactions every single day. To be cut off from this network is to be exiled from the modern world. No trade finance, no cross-border payments, total economic quarantine. The architects of this sanction in the West celebrated. They believed they had checkmated Moscow. The narrative was clear. The Russian economy would be crippled instantly. The ruble would turn into worthless paper. The domestic pressure would force a retreat or a regime change. It was supposed to be a demonstration of absolute American power. But 2.5 years later, the reality is terrifyingly different. Russia did not collapse. The ruble did not dissolve. Commerce continued, commodities flowed, and the Russian economy adapted. They found a backdoor. But the true catastrophe isn't about Russia's survival. It's about what the rest of the world saw. Dozens of nations watched the United States weaponize the neutral plumbing of the global economy and realized a chilling truth. If Washington can confiscate the reserves of a G20 member and a nuclear superpower, they can do it to anyone. If you value the truth that mainstream media ignores, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell, because what we are uncovering today is the roadmap to the single biggest wealth transfer in history, and you need to be prepared. This event in 2022 wasn't an isolated incident. It was the trigger for a historical pattern that has destroyed empires before. We have seen this movie 4 times in the last 110 years. The script is always the same. A dominant empire controls the flow of money. It becomes arrogant. It weaponizes the financial system to punish its rivals. But instead of victory, the targets build new shields. Neutral nations, fearing for their own safety, begin to hedge their bets. The weapon loses its potency, and the foundation of the empire crumbles. The United States thinks it is wielding the ultimate leverage. In reality, it is sawing off the branch it sits on. The data I am about to show you proves that the countdown has already started. When the British Empire weaponized the pound sterling in 1914, it took exactly 30 years for it to lose its reserve currency status. The US pulled the trigger on SWIFT in 2022. The clock is ticking, and thanks to modern technology, the collapse will happen much faster than 30 years. To understand why this backfired so spectacularly, you have to look under the hood of SWIFT. SWIFT is not a bank. It holds no cash. It creates no wealth. It is purely a communication protocol. If a bank in New York wants to send $1 million to a bank in Tokyo, SWIFT is the secure telegram that verifies the deal. It was created in 1973 to replace the slow, error-prone telex system, bringing speed and security to international trade. By 2024, it was processing over 11 billion messages a year. It is the lifeblood of the dollar system. Here is the leverage point. While SWIFT is technically a neutral cooperative based in Belgium, its board is heavily influenced by Western banks. More importantly, because the vast majority of international trade settles in US dollars via correspondent banks in New York, the United States holds the legal kill switch. The US Treasury can pressure SWIFT to disconnect any entity it chooses. We used this weapon in 2012 against Iran. It devastated them. Their oil exports vanished, inflation skyrocketed to 45%, and their economy shrank by nearly 9%. It forced them to the negotiating table. It looked like a victory. But while the West celebrated, Iran spent the next decade building immunity. They developed barter systems, used cryptocurrencies, and established non-dollar trade routes with China and Turkey. However, 2022 was different. Russia is the world's 11th largest economy and a critical supplier of energy and food. Disconnecting Russia wasn't just a sanction. It was a declaration of war on the concept of neutral finance. Every nation in the global south received the message loud and clear. Your sovereign wealth is not yours. It is allowed to exist only as long as you align with Washington's political interests. This created an existential crisis for the non-Western world. They faced a binary choice: accept permanent vulnerability to American whims or build a parallel system. They chose the latter. This is the exact moment the weapon backfired. History shows us that financial weaponization always accelerates decline. Let's look at the first precedent. The British Empire, World War I. Before 1914, the British pound was king. London was the financial capital of the world. But when war broke out, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act. They froze German assets. They seized ships and bank accounts. It was unprecedented. Before this, finance was considered separate from war. Britain broke the unwritten rule. While it hurt Germany in the short term, neutral countries watched with horror. They realized their assets in London were not safe if they ever disagreed with the British crown. Immediately after the war, central banks began diversifying. They bought gold. They moved accounts to New York and Paris. By 1920, the US held more gold than Britain. By 1944, the pound was dead as the global master, replaced by the dollar. Britain traded short-term tactical advantage for long-term strategic suicide. The United States repeated this mistake in 1979 with Iran. When the hostage crisis began, President Carter froze $12 billion of Iranian assets. It was justified legally, but the signal sent to the world was catastrophic. The OPEC nations, the oil kings of the Middle East, suddenly realized that a simple executive order could lock them out of their own wealth. Throughout the 1,980 seconds, we saw a quiet shift. OPEC nations reduced their dollar holdings from 85% down to 71%. They bought German marks, Japanese yen, and gold. They moved money to Zurich and Singapore. They learned that putting all their eggs in the New York basket was a fatal risk. The freeze got the hostages released eventually, but it cost the US the absolute trust of the financial world. Then came 2014. Russia annexed Crimea. The US responded with targeted sanctions, banning certain officials and restricting access for some banks. But we didn't cut SWIFT. It was a half measure. And this was a fatal strategic error. It signaled to Vladimir Putin that the US was hostile, but it left him with the resources to prepare. For 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, Russia actively de-dollarized. They dumped US treasuries, dropping their holdings from $130 billion to near zero. They stockpiled gold, doubling their reserves to 2,300 tons. They built the SPFS, their own domestic version of SWIFT. They signed deals with China and India to trade in local currencies. Putin warned the world repeatedly that the dollar was being used as a political weapon. The West ignored him. They said Russia was too integrated to decouple. They were wrong. When the 2022 hammer dropped, Russia was ready. The ruble crashed for exactly 3 days before the Russian central bank hiked rates to 20% and demanded gas payments in rubles. The currency recovered fully in 3 months. The sanctions failed to collapse the economy, but they succeeded in destroying the myth of the dollar's neutrality. What we are witnessing is not random chaos. It is a precise, 5-stage pattern of imperial decline. It happened to the British pound. It is happening to the US dollar. And the terrifying part is that we are no longer in the early stages. The data suggests we have already entered the terminal phase. Let me break down this death spiral so you can see exactly where we stand. Stage 1 is total dominance. This was the era from 1973 to 2022. The United States didn't technically own SWIFT, but we owned the currency that SWIFT moved. Because the vast majority of global banking settles in New York, Washington held the keys to the digital vault. We could turn off the lights on anyone, anywhere. This power was absolute, and for decades, it went unchallenged. Then came stage 2, weaponization. Power is addictive. Starting after 9/11, Washington began using the financial system not just for trade, but as a hammer for foreign policy. We sanctioned terrorists. Then we sanctioned rogue states like North Korea. Then Iran. With every sanction, we normalized the idea that money is a weapon. By February 2022, cutting off a G20 nation like Russia felt like the next logical step. It was easy. The infrastructure was there. The political will was there. So, we froze $300 billion of their sovereign reserves with a single signature, but that triggered stage 3, the escape. When the castle gate slams shut, you find another way out. Denied access to SWIFT, Moscow didn't just roll over. They activated their own domestic system, the SPFS. More importantly, they pivoted east. They hooked into CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system. They started trading in crypto. They reverted to barter. By 2024, nearly 40% of Russian trade was being conducted completely outside the dollar ecosystem. They proved to the world that the dollar prison has a back door. This leads to the most critical and dangerous phase for the American economy. Stage 4, the hedging of neutrals. This is the turning point. It's not just about America's enemies finding alternatives. It's about America's friends running for the exits. China looked at the Russia sanctions and saw a preview of its own future. If they invade Taiwan, their trillions in US assets are gone. So, Beijing started a massive liquidation event. They dumped US treasuries, slashing their holdings from $1.3 trillion down to $775 billion. That is a fire sale of American debt. Simultaneously, they went on a gold buying spree that hasn't been seen since the 1,970 seconds. Officially, they hold 2,200 tons. Unofficially, analysts estimate it's double that. They are building a war chest that cannot be frozen by the US Treasury. But the biggest blow came from an old ally, Saudi Arabia. For 50 years, the petrodollar deal was the bedrock of American hegemony. The Saudis sold oil exclusively in dollars, forcing every nation on earth to hoard our currency. That monopoly effectively ended in 2023. Riyadh announced they would accept Chinese yuan for oil. In December 2024, they formally joined the BRICS alliance. The message was subtle but devastating. The dollar is no longer the only king in the oil market. Even the UAE and Brazil started settling trade in local currencies. Over 50 central banks globally are now piloting systems to bypass SWIFT. They aren't doing this because they hate America. They are doing it because they saw $300 billion vanish into thin air, and they realized that in a dollar-denominated world, they don't own their money, they are just renting space in an American bank. Finally, we arrive at stage 5. The weapon loses power. This is the stage we are living in right now. The sanction weapon was a one-time use nuke. We fired it, and now everyone has built a bunker. Look at the data. It is screaming a warning. In 1999, the dollar accounted for 71% of global reserves. Today, in 2024, that number has crashed to 58%. That is a 13-point drop, representing trillions of dollars moving into other assets. But look closer at trade settlement. In just 2 years since the SWIFT ban, the dollar's share of global trade payments dropped from 73% to 58%. That is a cliff-edge collapse. While SWIFT volume is still high, its market share is bleeding out. China's CIPS system processed 136 million messages in 2023, a 50% explosion in growth in a single year. Russia's SPFS is handling 2 million messages daily. India's UPI system is going global. The monopoly is shattered. The United States achieved a tactical victory by hurting the Russian economy in the short term, but we suffered a strategic catastrophe. We taught the world how to live without us. By weaponizing the system, we accelerated the creation of the very thing we feared most. A decentralized, multipolar financial order where Washington can no longer dictate terms. Britain went through this exact 5-stage decline between 1914 and 1944. It took them 30 years to lose the crown. But we don't have 30 years. In the digital age, capital moves at the speed of light. The timeline has been compressed, and here is the terrifying reality. The US economy is structured entirely around the privilege of printing the global reserve currency. We run massive deficits. We import everything. We borrow trillions cheaply. If that privilege evaporates, if the world stops needing dollars to buy oil and trade, the American standard of living will face a correction unlike anything in our history. So, is the dollar going to zero tomorrow? No. But are we looking at a future where inflation is persistent, interest rates stay high, and your purchasing power is slowly drained away to pay for the debts of a dying empire? Absolutely. In the next part, I am going to show you the specific timeline. We will calculate exactly how many years the dollar has left, based on the British precedent and the current acceleration of technology. And we will reveal the biggest winners of this shift hint. It's not just China. You might be thinking, this sounds like alarmist theory. It isn't. The data is already in, and the numbers are screaming a warning that Washington refuses to hear. Let's look at the hard evidence proving the dollar system is bleeding out right now. Exhibit A, the Russian experiment. Before the sanctions in 2021, 87% of Russia's trade settlements flowed through the US dollar or the euro. They were trapped in the Western web. By 2024, that number collapsed to just 60%. That means 40% of the trade from a massive G20 economy worth hundreds of billions has successfully migrated to the yuan, the ruble, and the rupee. Russia became patient zero, proving to the world that an economy can not only survive but grow without touching a single US dollar. Exhibit B, the rise of CIPS. While Western media ignored it, China's alternative to SWIFT, the cross-border interbank payment system, has gone parabolic. In 2020, it processed about $12 trillion worth of yuan. By 2023, that number rocketed to $27 trillion. It more than doubled in 3 years. It now connects over 1,400 financial institutions across 110 countries. This is no longer a backup plan. It is a fully functioning highway for global capital that bypasses New York entirely. Exhibit C, the gold rush. Watch what central banks do, not what they say. In 2022, central banks bought a record-breaking 1,136 tons of gold. In 2023 and 2024, the buying spree continued at over 1,000 tons annually. This is the highest level of sustained accumulation since the 1,970 seconds right before the Bretton Woods system collapsed. Who is buying? China, Russia, India, Turkey, Singapore. They are frantically swapping their electronic dollars, which can be frozen by a keystroke, for physical gold bars, which have no counterparty risk. They are voting against the dollar with their wallets. Exhibit D, the BRICS Expansion. The most dangerous threat to the dollar isn't a country. It's a bloc. BRICS has expanded from 5 members to 9, now including major oil powers like Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. This bloc now controls 42% of global oil production. At their 2023 summit, they openly discussed a common currency backed by commodities. When the world's biggest oil producers and the world's biggest factories join forces to bypass your currency, your monopoly is effectively dead. So, how much time do we have left? History provides a terrifyingly precise roadmap. Let's look at the British precedent. In 1914, the British Empire weaponized the global financial system to crush Germany. They seized assets. They blocked trade. It was their version of the SWIFT ban. At that moment, the pound sterling was the undisputed king of money. Exactly 30 years later, in 1944, the pound was dethroned at the Bretton Woods Conference, replaced formally by the US dollar. It took 3 decades for the consequences of weaponization to fully destroy the currency's trust. Now, apply that math to us. The United States pulled the trigger on the SWIFT weapon in 2022. If we follow the British timeline of 30 years, the dollar ceases to be the dominant reserve currency by 2052. But we don't live in 1914. We live in the digital age. Back then, building a new banking system took decades of laying cables and shipping gold. Today, digital payment infrastructure scales exponentially. CIPS doubled in 3 years. Crypto moves billions in seconds. Technology accelerates history. Because of this digital acceleration factor, we need to cut that timeline in half. My analysis suggests we don't have 30 years. We have 15 to 20 years, maximum. This puts the terminal decline of the dollar somewhere between 2037 and 2042. The trajectory is already set in stone. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen by 13 percentage points in the last 25 years, but the rate of decline is speeding up. In just the last 2 years since the sanctions, we've lost market share faster than in the previous decade combined. If this acceleration continues, the dollar's share could drop below the critical 45% threshold by as early as 2035. When that happens, the exorbitant privilege ends. The ability of the US government to borrow $2 trillion a year simply because foreigners need to hold our paper will vanish. What happens to an economy built on infinite debt when the credit card is finally cut up? What happens to the American way of life when we can no longer export our inflation to the rest of the world? In the final part of this series, I'm going to reveal the winners and losers of this new world order. Who rises from the ashes of the dollar system? And most importantly, what does this mean for your bank account, your retirement, and the purchasing power of the money in your pocket? The conclusion is not what you think. So, when the dust settles on this financial earthquake, who is left standing, and who gets buried in the rubble? The winners are obvious. China takes the crown. They possess the world's largest manufacturing base, and now, the fastest growing payment infrastructure. Beijing didn't need to defeat America militarily. They just had to wait for Washington to weaponize its own banking system, forcing the world into the arms of the Yuan. Russia wins a strategic victory. They proved that the king of sanctions has no clothes. By surviving the SWIFT ban, they destroyed the fear that kept the US in power. They are no longer isolated. They are the architects of the new bloc. Gold wins. As faith in fiat currency evaporates, central banks are returning to the only asset with no counterparty risk. Alternative systems win. CIPS, crypto, and decentralized ledgers are feasting on the market share that SWIFT is bleeding out. But who are the losers? Europe is the first casualty. By chaining themselves to US foreign policy, they cut off cheap energy and lost their autonomous financial voice. They are drifting into irrelevance, squeezed between American decline and Asian rise. SWIFT becomes a legacy system, the MySpace of global finance still there, but no longer the only game in town. But the biggest loser is not the US government. It is you, the American citizen. For 80 years, Americans have lived a life subsidized by the rest of the world. Because the dollar was the reserve currency, we could print trillions to pay for wars, welfare, and tax cuts without suffering hyperinflation. We exported our inflation to other countries. We bought cheap goods from China and cheap oil from the Saudis with paper we printed out of thin air. That era is over. This is the end of the free lunch. As the dollar loses its status, foreign demand for U.S. debt collapses. To attract buyers, interest rates on U.S. treasuries must rise and stay high. This makes the $36 trillion national debt unserviceable. The U.S. government will face a brutal choice: default on the debt, or print so much money that the dollar loses 50% of its value in a decade. For you, this means a permanent reduction in your standard of living. It means imports, electronics, cars, clothes, coffee will skyrocket in price. It means your retirement savings, sitting in dollar-denominated assets, will lose purchasing power faster than it gains interest. It means the American dream of effortless consumption is being replaced by the hard reality of economic gravity. The verdict. In February 2022, the United States fired the financial equivalent of a nuclear weapon. It looked tough. It looked decisive. But financial nukes can only be used once. The moment you use them, you force your enemies and your friends to build a defense shield. We taught the world a lesson we can never unteach. If you use the dollar, you are not safe. Britain weaponized the pound in 1914 and lost the empire by 1944. The US weaponized SWIFT in 2022. The math says we lose the empire by 2042. But technology moves fast. The collapse isn't waiting for the future. It's knocking on the door right now. This wasn't a murder. It was a suicide. The US financial empire didn't die because of Chinese genius or Russian resilience. It died because, in a moment of arrogance, it pulled the trigger on the very tool that kept it alive. 20 years from now, historians will look back at February 26th, 2022, not as the day we punished Russia, but as the day the American financial century officially ended. They just didn't know it yet. If you want to survive this shift, you need to know where to move your money before the final stage hits. In my next video, I will reveal the asset allocation blueprint for a post-dollar world. Don't be the last one holding the bag. Subscribe now.